The centerpiece at my table was dying. 3 white roses leaning sideways in a glass vase, petals curling at the edges. I straightened one with my finger and it came off in my hand. Table 14. The last table, closest to the kitchen doors, where the smell of dinner rolls came through stronger than the flowers. My sister's wedding had 212 guests. My parents had put me here, between Jennifer's college roommate's husband and an elderly neighbor named Harold, who was already asleep. My mother had said it that morning while adjusting Jennifer's veil, without looking at me. Sit with the Hendersons. And Rachel, don't embarrass us. I was still holding the petal when James Whitfield stood up at the head table. He picked up his glass, looked out across the ballroom, and his gaze traveled from table to table until it stopped. On me. He set the glass down. The room was still laughing at something the best man had said. James waited. Then he loosened his tie. Before I talk about my son, he said, I need to talk about someone in this room that most of you have misunderstood. My mother's hand moved to my father's wheelchair. She gripped the armrest. She already knew. To understand why I was sitting alone at table 14 while 200 people celebrated my sister, and why my mother was gripping that armrest before James said a word. I have to go back 3 years, to the Tuesday afternoon my father's legs gave out in the kitchen and he didn't get up. I was at my desk at Meadowbrook Elementary when my phone rang. The school secretary held up one finger. I had a parent at the window, but I saw the caller was my mother, and my mother never called during work hours. She called on Sunday evenings after church, and only if Jennifer hadn't already given her the week's news for both of us. Your father fell, she said. He's not getting up. I drove 3 hours that afternoon with the radio off, and my hands tight on the wheel. Jennifer lived 40 minutes from our parents. She didn't answer her phone that day, or the next, or the day after that. When she finally called back, she asked which hospital, wrote it down, and said she'd try to come that weekend. She didn't come that weekend. I moved into the spare bedroom. The room had a single window facing my mother's rose garden and a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar and old soap. I told myself it would be 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'd help my father through physical therapy, get my mother settled into a routine, and go home. That was 3 years ago. The quilt still smelled like cedar. The roses went untended after the first winter. And 2 weeks became the rest of this story. The stroke took my father's left side and most of his speech. The doctors said he was lucky. Their word, not mine. Because the clot dissolved before it killed him. He came home in a wheelchair 6 weeks later with a mouth that could manage about 30 words on a good day, and a right hand that still gripped mine when I sat beside him. My mother handled the first month the way she handled everything, by organizing. She made a schedule on the refrigerator with colored markers. Physical therapy at 10, speech therapy at 2, medication at 8 and 8. She bought a whiteboard for the hallway so my father could point at words he couldn't say. She labeled the kitchen cabinets with masking tape and neat block letters so he could find things on his own. She did not, however, open the mail. I found the bills on a Thursday evening. I was looking for a can opener in the kitchen junk drawer. The one next to the stove that holds rubber bands, dead batteries, and takeout menus from restaurants that closed years ago. Under a phone book no one had touched since the Clinton administration, there was a stack of envelopes. Some opened, most not. The open ones had been read and refolded carefully, as if putting them back in shape would undo what they said. Medical bills. 7 of them. The oldest was 4 months past due. 2 were stamped "Final Notice" in red ink, the kind of red that doesn't photograph well but stays in your memory. 1 from the hospital. 1 from the physical therapy center. 1 from a specialist whose name I didn't recognize. On the top envelope, a yellow sticky note in my mother's handwriting. Jennifer will handle. I held that sticky note for a long time. Jennifer hadn't been to the house in 8 weeks. Jennifer had sent one bouquet of sunflowers when my father came home from the hospital and had called 3 times since. Twice to ask how he was doing, once to say she couldn't make it for Thanksgiving. Jennifer was not handling anything. My mother was in the den watching her program. I could hear the television through the wall. Some courtroom show she liked. The judge's voice rising and falling in rhythms I'd memorized from childhood. I put the bills in my purse. I didn't tell her. I sat down at the kitchen table with the junk drawer still open and the phone book sitting on the counter like a relic, and I wrote down every number and every amount on the back of an old grocery list. The total was $6,400. 2 accounts were in collections. The next morning, I called each office before work. I set up payment plans on 4 of them and paid 2 outright from my savings. The woman at the hospital billing department asked if I was Jennifer. I said no. She said, "Oh, the other daughter." I said yes. She said the account had been assigned to Jennifer 6 months ago, and no payment had ever been received. I thanked her and hung up. I folded the grocery list and put it in the back of my wallet, behind my library card, where I wouldn't see it every time I bought coffee, but where I'd know it was there. That evening, I asked my mother if Jennifer had mentioned anything about the medical bills. "Jennifer's been so busy," my mother said. She was folding towels in the living room, pressing each one flat with the heel of her hand. "She'll come when she can." She folded another towel. She didn't look up. The courtroom show was still on in the background, and the judge was telling someone they should have read the fine print. 3 months passed. The spare bedroom became my room. I hung my work clothes in the closet next to a row of my mother's old coats that smelled like mothballs and decades. I brought my own pillow from home, the one from my apartment 200 miles away, where my mail was piling up, and my neighbor was watering my plants, and my landlord had begun leaving messages I hadn't returned. I was paying $800 a month toward my father's medical bills. I'd set up autopay from my checking account, which meant I saw the withdrawals every month on the 15th like a second rent I couldn't explain to anyone. My salary at Meadowbrook covered it. Barely. I stopped eating out. I canceled the streaming services. I drove my father's old Buick instead of my car to save on gas, because his tank was bigger, and my mother kept it filled as part of her routine, and she never asked where the gas was going. One Sunday in October, I went to church with my mother. My father stayed home. The wheelchair didn't fit well in the pew, and he got frustrated when he couldn't sing the hymns. I sat beside my mother in the 3rd row, same as always, and I nodded at the people I'd known since childhood. Mrs. Delaney, the Carters, Pastor Williams and his wife, who always brought banana bread to everything, even funerals. After the service, I was carrying a plate of lemon bars to the fellowship hall when I stopped in the corridor outside the kitchen. My mother was standing by the coffee table with Diane Foster, her oldest friend, the one she played bridge with on Wednesdays, and I heard my mother say, "Jennifer's been such a blessing. She's handling all the medical bills so I can focus on Robert." Diane nodded. "You're lucky to have her." "I don't know what I'd do without her," my mother said. I stood in the hallway holding the lemon bars. The plate was warm against my fingers. Someone had put too much powdered sugar on top, and it was drifting onto my blouse like fine snow. I could have walked in. I could have set the plate down on the coffee table and said something. Something calm, something factual, something like, "Actually, I'm the one paying the bills." I didn't. I don't know why. I'd like to say I was keeping the peace, or that I was being mature, or that I understood my mother's need to shape the story her own way. But the truth is simpler. I was tired. I'd been sleeping in a spare bedroom for 3 months, paying bills I couldn't afford, driving a car that wasn't mine, and the idea of correcting my mother in front of Diane Foster while holding a plate of lemon bars at church was just more than I had in me that morning. My mother had a gift for telling stories where the facts were technically present, but arranged in an order that built a different house. She didn't lie outright. She relocated the truth. Jennifer had mentioned the bills once on the phone. That was enough for my mother to build a narrative where Jennifer was managing the entire situation. After the coffee hour, I washed the serving plate alone in the church kitchen. The water was too hot. Steam rose off the porcelain and fogged my glasses. Through the door, I could hear laughter from the fellowship hall, and my mother's voice carrying above it, telling someone another story I would not correct. On a Saturday in late November, I wheeled my father into the garden. The air had that thin, cool quality that comes just before real cold sets in. The kind of morning where you can see your breath if you try, but the sun is warm enough on your arms that you don't reach for a jacket. My father wore the flannel shirt I'd buttoned for him that morning, the green one, his favorite, and a blanket across his lap that my mother had crocheted years ago for the living room couch. The rose garden was a mess. My mother had planted those roses the summer my father retired. 12 bushes along the back fence, each one a different color. She'd tended them every Saturday for 9 years, trimming and feeding and talking to them the way some women talk to their plants, and some women talk to God. After the stroke, she stopped going outside. The roses grew into each other. Canes crossed and tangled. Dead heads sat brown and curled on stems no one had cut. I knelt in the dirt beside the wheelchair and pulled weeds. My father watched. His eyes followed my hands, the way I separated the grass from the base of each bush, the way I broke off the dead wood and piled it on the flagstone path. He liked watching people work. He always had. When I was a girl, he'd sit on the porch with his coffee while I raked leaves, and he'd say, "Good job, Rach," every few minutes whether I needed to hear it or not. He couldn't say that now. Most days his words came out in fragments, half-formed sounds that trailed off before they landed. He'd try, and his face would tighten with the effort, and then he'd stop and look away. But that morning, while I was pulling a long runner of crabgrass from the base of a yellow bush, he reached down and touched my hand. I looked up. His fingers closed around mine. He squeezed once, and then he said it. Rachel. Not Jennifer. Not a fragment. My whole name, clear and complete, spoken with the kind of effort that costs something. I squeezed back and didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He knew I was there. He'd always known. He just couldn't say it in front of my mother, or couldn't say it loud enough for it to matter, or couldn't say it in a way that would change anything. But he could say my name in a garden on a Saturday morning, and he did. I went back to pulling weeds. He kept his hand on the armrest of the wheelchair, close to where mine had been. We stayed like that for 20 minutes. The sun moved across the yard. A neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. The dead roses collected on the path. When I looked up toward the house, my mother was standing at the kitchen window. Her arms were crossed. She was watching us. Not with anger, exactly, but with something harder to name. Something closed. She didn't come outside. She stood there for a moment, arms folded tight across her chest, and then she turned away from the window and began loading the dishwasher. I could hear the plates clinking through the glass. In January, my mother had a doctor's appointment. She'd been having headaches, stress, probably, though she would never use that word. And her internist wanted blood work. She left at 9:30 and told me she'd be back by noon. I was sorting the mail at the kitchen table when I found the envelope. It was addressed to my father, Robert Calloway, the name printed in the small formal type banks use when they want you to know the letter is serious. I almost put it in the stack. I'd been opening his mail for months by then, paying the bills that arrived, filing the ones that didn't need action. My mother had stopped pretending she'd handle it. This one was different. A quarterly statement from his retirement account. The one he'd built over 34 years at the plant. I opened it the way I opened everything, with a butter knife and low expectations. The balance was lower than it should have been, not by a small amount. I read the line 3 times to make sure I was understanding the columns. There was a withdrawal, a single withdrawal, dated 8 months before the stroke. $47,000. The memo line read, transfer, Jennifer, house renovation. I set the statement down on the table. The butter knife was still in my hand. The kitchen was quiet. The clock above the stove ticked the way it always ticked, and the dishwasher my mother had run that morning was in its final cycle, humming low. $47,000 from my father's retirement for Jennifer. I picked up my phone and called my sister. She answered on the fourth ring, which was fast for Jennifer. I could hear traffic in the background and the low murmur of a radio. "I'm looking at Dad's retirement statement," I said. A pause. The traffic sounds continued. "Okay," she said. "There's a withdrawal for $47,000, under your name, for a house renovation." Jennifer didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. Her voice shifted into the register she used when she was explaining something she'd already decided was reasonable. "Mom said I needed it more. You've always been fine on your own, Rachel. You manage. You always have." "Did any of it go to the house?" Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear her turn the radio down. "I used it for the wedding fund. David's family expects a certain kind of wedding." The dishwasher clicked off. The kitchen went very quiet. "Does Mom know?" "It was her idea," Jennifer said. Her voice was flat now, the way a door is flat when it's closed. "She offered. I didn't ask. I didn't say anything after that." Jennifer waited for a few seconds, and when I didn't speak, she said she had to go. She was meeting the florist at 11. They were choosing between peonies and garden roses for the centerpieces, and David's mother had opinions about everything. She said goodbye the way she always did, quick and clean, like hanging up was something she'd practiced until it was painless. I sat at the kitchen table with the bank statement in front of me. The butter knife lay across the torn envelope. The sun came through the window above the sink and lit the edge of the page, and I could see my father's name in that formal bank type, and below it the number 47,000, printed in a font that didn't care what it meant. I thought about the $800 a month I'd been paying. I thought about the grocery list in the back of my wallet. I thought about the sticky note in the junk drawer. "Jennifer will handle." And I thought about my mother standing at church telling Diane Foster how blessed she was to have a daughter like Jennifer. I folded the statement and put it in the same spot in my wallet where I'd kept the grocery list, behind the library card, where I would know it was there. My mother came home at 12:15, dropped her purse on the counter, and said the blood work would take 3 days. She asked if anything had come in the mail. I said no. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down across from me at the table, and we sat there together in the kitchen where everything had changed and nothing showed. I waited 3 days. I told myself I was being strategic, but that wasn't true. I was afraid. Not of my mother, of what would happen to the version of our family I'd been carrying in my head since I was a girl. The version where my mother was difficult but fair. Where Jennifer was careless but not cruel. Where the imbalance between us was accidental, not designed. On Sunday evening, my mother was making pot roast. She stood at the counter with her back to me, peeling carrots with the same short strokes she'd used for 40 years. The kitchen smelled like onions and beef, and the warmth of an oven that had been running since 4 o'clock. My father was in the den. I could hear the television, a nature program, birds, through the wall. I put the bank statement on the counter beside the cutting board. My mother looked at it. She didn't pick it up. She set the peeler down and wiped her hands on the towel she kept looped through the oven handle. Her hands were steady. She'd been expecting this. Maybe not today, but she'd known the statement would find its way to the kitchen eventually. "Jennifer needed help," she said. "Jennifer took $47,000 from Dad's retirement," I said, "for her wedding." "She needed help, Rachel. You've always managed." That phrase again. You've always managed. As if managing were a talent and not a weight. As if the fact that I could carry things meant I should carry everything. "You told the church Jennifer was paying the medical bills," I said. My mother's hands went still. She looked at the counter, not at me. The carrots lay in uneven pieces on the cutting board. It's nobody's business who pays what in this family. Then why did you make it everybody's business by naming Jennifer? She didn't answer. The pot roast hissed behind her in the oven. The kitchen fan hummed. Somewhere in the den, my father's nature program moved on to a different bird, and the narrator's voice dropped low, explaining something about migration patterns and how some species return to the same nest year after year. I think the roast needs turning, my mother said. She picked up the oven mitt. She opened the oven door. She pulled the rack forward and adjusted the pan with both hands, and the wave of heat that came out carried the smell of beef and bay leaves, and something burnt at the edges. She pushed the rack back in and closed the door and hung the mitt on the hook by the stove. She did not turn around. I stood at the counter with the bank statement between us and the carrots half peeled, and the question I'd asked hanging in the air alongside the smell of onions. I wanted her to answer. I wanted her to say something real, something that acknowledged what she'd done, or at least acknowledged what she'd chosen. She rearranged the towel on the oven handle. She picked up the peeler. She started on a new carrot. The question stayed where I'd left it, on the counter, in the steam, in the silence between us that smelled like Sunday dinner and tasted like something else entirely. My mother wrote a Christmas letter every year. She'd been doing it since 1987, typed, single-spaced, photocopied at the church office, and mailed in envelopes she addressed by hand because she believed printed labels were lazy. The letters followed a formula: my father's health, the house, the garden, Jennifer's accomplishments, and then a sentence about me, usually near the bottom, usually beginning with Rachel is, and ending with something that could fit on the back of a postage stamp. In December, I found that year's draft on the printer. I wasn't looking for it. I was printing a receipt for the pharmacy. My father's medication had gone up again, and I needed the records for his insurance. The draft was sitting in the tray, warm and crisp, 2 pages of my mother's annual report to everyone she'd ever exchanged a casserole with. I read it standing at the printer in the hallway, the pharmacy receipt in one hand and the letter in the other. Jennifer was mentioned 4 times. Jennifer's generous spirit. Jennifer's tireless dedication to her parents' care. Jennifer and David's upcoming wedding, which we are all so excited about. Jennifer, who has been a rock for this family during a difficult year. My name appeared once. Rachel is keeping busy with her work. 5 words. After 3 years of sleeping in the spare bedroom, paying the bills, driving my father to physical therapy, pulling weeds in the rose garden, washing the dishes, sorting the mail, folding the towels, sitting with him on Saturday mornings while my mother stayed inside. 5 words. Busy with her work. I put the letter back in the printer tray. I took my receipt and went to the kitchen. Then I picked up the phone and called Aunt Dorothy. Dorothy was my mother's younger sister. She lived in Greenville, 2 hours south, and she visited twice a year, Easter and Thanksgiving. She brought pie both times and opinions all the time, and she was the only person in the family who asked questions that had teeth. "Dorothy," I said, "when's the last time you heard from Mom about how Dad's doing?" Dorothy said my mother called every few weeks. "She told me you only visit once a month. She said Jennifer drives up every weekend." I held the phone against my ear and watched the kitchen window, where the afternoon light was falling flat across the counter. "I've been living here for 10 months, Dorothy." Silence. I could hear Dorothy breathing, and behind that the hum of her refrigerator, and behind that whatever was playing on her kitchen TV. The news, probably. Dorothy always had the news on. "Oh, honey," she said. I let the silence sit. Dorothy was processing, and Dorothy processed out loud when she was ready, not before. She told me, she told Barbara and Linda too, that Jennifer was handling everything. The money, the appointments, all of it. "She wasn't," I said. Another silence. Then Dorothy said very quietly, "I know your mother. I've known her longer than you have, and I'm going to tell you something, but not on the phone. Come see me after Christmas." I said I would. I hung up and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. The house was behind me. The Christmas letter was on the printer. My father was inside, probably in his wheelchair by the window. My mother was somewhere in there too, building the world she wanted to live in, one sentence at a time. I made a decision sitting in that car. I didn't know when it would matter, but I knew it was done. The next time someone asked me directly, to my face, with a real question, I would tell the truth. All of it. I was finished correcting the record in private. I was finished having conversations in kitchens and hallways that changed nothing. I didn't know yet that the person who would ask would be a 72-year-old lawyer I hadn't met, at a dinner I hadn't been invited to, about a family he was about to marry into. Jennifer's bridal shower was held in March, at a restaurant in town, with white tablecloths and cloth napkins folded into shapes that were supposed to be swans, but looked more like question marks. My mother had organized it, the invitations, the menu, the seating. She wore her good navy dress and her pearl earrings and moved through the room like a woman running for office, greeting guests, adjusting centerpieces, making sure the correct kind of sparkling water was on each table. I was there because I was Jennifer's sister, which was the only credential my mother hadn't managed to reassign. My job was to carry gifts from the table by the door to the pile near the head of the room. I carried them in both arms, wrapped boxes, bags stuffed with tissue paper, envelopes thick with cards. Someone had brought a stand mixer. Someone else had brought monogrammed towels. I set them down and went back for more, and no one asked me to sit. At the dessert table, my mother introduced me to David's mother, Caroline. Caroline was tall, well-dressed, and had the kind of smile that had been practiced at charity events. "This is our younger one," my mother said, her hand on my shoulder like a caption. "She keeps to herself." Caroline was gracious. She said it was nice to meet me. She asked what I did. I told her I was an office manager at an elementary school, and she nodded the way people nod when they're deciding if they need to remember your answer. Then my mother turned to Caroline and said, "Jennifer sacrificed so much for us this year. With Robert's health, well, you can imagine, she's been our anchor." I was standing 3 feet away. My mother said it as if I were part of the wallpaper, present, functional, not part of the composition. Jennifer was across the room opening a gift, laughing, holding up a set of wine glasses. She didn't correct it. She hadn't corrected anything in 3 years. I went to the restroom and stood at the sink for a minute. Then I went back out. In the side hallway near the kitchen, Dorothy found me. She hadn't forgotten our phone call. She pulled me aside and spoke low enough that the waitstaff passing with trays couldn't hear. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About your mother." She told me about Grandma Edith, how my mother had grown up the middle child of 3 sisters, how Edith had favored the youngest, Aunt Linda, openly and without apology. Linda got the new dresses. Linda got the front seat. Linda got the college fund. My mother got hand-me-downs and the expectation that she would manage. "Your grandmother had a favorite too," Dorothy said. "It wasn't your mom." I leaned against the wall. The hallway smelled like bread and dish soap. I could hear Jennifer laughing through the wall. "She's doing to you what was done to her," Dorothy said. "That doesn't make it right. But I thought you should know where it started." For a moment, something opened in my chest, a door I hadn't expected. A version of my mother I could feel sorry for. A girl in hand-me-downs watching her younger sister get everything, learning that love had a hierarchy, and the only way to survive it was to pick your own favorite and hold on tight. Then I heard my mother's voice through the wall, louder now, talking to Caroline again. "Jennifer has such a gift for caring. She gets that from me." The door closed. I thanked Dorothy. She squeezed my arm and went back to the party. I was clearing dessert plates when I noticed David's father standing in the doorway of the restaurant, James Whitfield. He'd come to pick up David, who'd been banished from the shower after making the mistake of walking past the gift table. James was tall, gray-haired, wearing a weekend blazer and the kind of shoes that had been resoled more than once. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and he was watching my mother talk to his wife. He'd heard her. I could see it in his face. Not anger, not surprise, but the look of a man who reads things carefully for a living and has just heard something that doesn't match the file. He caught my eye across the room. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He stood there a moment longer than a man picking up his son would need to stand, and then he turned and walked out. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening in May, in a private dining room at a steakhouse David's family had chosen. The room had dark wood paneling and low lighting, and the kind of heavy silverware that makes you aware of your hands. There were 30 people. I was seated at the far end of the table, past David's college roommates and a row of cousins I didn't know, in the chair closest to the door to the kitchen. James Whitfield sat down next to me. He didn't have to. His place card was at the other end, near David and Jennifer and the parents. I'd seen it when I walked in. Mr. James Whitfield in calligraphy on cream-colored cardstock. But when the salads arrived, there he was, pulling out the chair beside me and setting his napkin on his lap, as if he'd always planned to sit here. "Rachel," he said, "I don't think we've met properly." He asked about my work. I told him about Meadowbrook, the front office, the parents, the children who came in with notes they'd written themselves because their parents forgot. He asked about the school the way a man asks when he's actually listening, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. Then he asked how long I'd been helping with my father's care. 3 years, I said. Since the stroke. He cut a piece of steak. He chewed it slowly. Your mother says Jennifer handles the finances. I looked at my plate. The salad had walnuts in it, and one of them was sitting on top of a leaf of arugula like a small brown knot. I could have said what I'd been saying for 3 years. Nothing. I could have redirected, softened, managed. But I was sitting in a steakhouse I hadn't been invited to plan, at a table where my place card was closest to the exit, wearing a dress I'd bought on clearance because I couldn't afford full price anymore, and James Whitfield had asked me a direct question with quiet eyes and a steady voice. No, I said. I do. James nodded. He didn't look surprised. He set his fork down and wiped his mouth with the cloth napkin and folded it once on his knee. My firm reviewed some financial documents for the prenuptial agreement, he said. I'm not going to tell you what I found, but I want you to know that families have a way of misremembering who did what. He paused. It's not always accidental. I didn't ask what he'd found. I could feel the shape of it. The $47,000, the medical bills, the retirement account, pressing against the conversation like a hand behind a curtain. He knew. He'd seen the numbers, and he was sitting here, next to me, at the end of the table, because the numbers told a story my mother had spent 3 years rewriting. My own mother, he said, and a small smile crossed his face. Kept a list of every casserole anyone ever brought to the house. She remembered who skimped on the cheese. 40 years later, she'd bring it up at Thanksgiving. I smiled. It was the first time I'd smiled at a family event in months. Families keep records, he said, even when they pretend they don't. He changed the subject after that. He asked about the school again, about the kids, about whether the building was old or new. He told me his grandson was in 2nd grade and had recently learned to tie his shoes and considered it his greatest achievement. We talked about ordinary things, the kind of conversation you have with someone who isn't trying to extract information or build a case, but is simply acknowledging that you are here, that you exist, that your chair at the end of the table is not where you belong. When the toasts began, James went back to his assigned seat. Before he left, he put his hand on the back of my chair, not my shoulder, not my arm, just the chair, and said, "I'm glad we talked, Rachel." I watched him walk back up the table to his seat near David and Jennifer and my parents. My mother was laughing at something David had said. Jennifer was leaning into David, her hand on his arm, the ring catching the light. James sat down, picked up his water glass, and looked at his notes for tomorrow's toast. I wondered what was in those notes. I wondered how much of what he'd found in the prenuptial documents had traveled from his desk to that folded piece of paper in his breast pocket. I didn't know yet, but I knew he was a man who read things carefully, and I knew he'd just read me. The night before the wedding, I went to my father's room. He was in his wheelchair by the window. The curtains were open and the street light outside cast a yellow stripe across the carpet. The room smelled like the eucalyptus rub I bought him every month at the pharmacy, a sharp, clean smell that had become the smell of his room, the way cedar and old soap had once been the smell of the spare bedroom that had become mine. His eyes were open. He was watching the street, or maybe just watching the light, or maybe watching nothing at all. Some evenings he sat by the window and I couldn't tell if he was thinking or resting or somewhere in between, in that place where the body stays and the mind goes walking. I knelt beside the wheelchair. The carpet was thin under my knees. I could hear the television in the den. My mother watching something, the volume up high the way she kept it now that she was alone in the evenings. "Hey, Dad," I said. He turned his head. His eyes found mine. They were clear tonight, present, focused, the eyes of a man who was still in there, even if the words had mostly gone. He reached for my hand. His fingers were thinner than they used to be. The stroke had taken muscle and weight from his left side, and even his right hand, the good hand, felt lighter than I remembered. He closed his fingers around mine the way he had in the garden, months ago. The same grip, the same intention. Then he spoke. 3 words, each one pulled out of whatever deep place his language had gone to hide. His mouth worked around them, and his brow tightened, and then they came, clear and whole. "You, good girl." I held his hand and I pressed my forehead against his knuckles and I stayed there. He smelled like eucalyptus and the clean cotton of the shirt I'd ironed that morning. His breathing was steady. His hand was warm. He couldn't fix what my mother had done. He couldn't stand up at dinner and say, "Rachel is the one who's been here. Rachel pays the bills. Rachel sleeps in the spare room and drives me to therapy and pulls the weeds from the roses Margaret planted and forgot." He couldn't say any of that, and maybe he never would have, even before the stroke. My father had spent his life loving my mother more than he loved his own voice, and that silence had cost him in ways I was only beginning to count. But he could say 3 words to his daughter in a dark room on the night before a wedding. And he did. I heard footsteps in the hallway. My mother appeared in the doorway, backlit by the hall light. "Time for bed, Robert," she said. She crossed the room and took the handles of the wheelchair. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask what we'd been talking about, or why I was kneeling on the floor, or why my eyes were red. She turned the wheelchair toward the door and pushed it into the hallway. In the hallway, with her back to me, she said, "Tomorrow, don't make this about you." The wheelchair's wheels clicked softly on the hardwood. The hall light fell across the carpet and then narrowed to a sliver as she pulled his door partway closed. I was still kneeling on the floor. The room smelled like eucalyptus. The window was still open. The streetlight was still there. The wedding morning was warm. Late May in Virginia, the air already thick before 9 o'clock. I was at the venue by 7:30, folding napkins into the swan shapes the planner had demonstrated the night before. Mine looked closer to the question marks from the bridal shower. I folded them anyway. Jennifer was in the bridal suite upstairs with my mother, the bridesmaids, and a makeup artist whose name I didn't learn. I hadn't been asked to join them. I wasn't a bridesmaid. The wedding party was David's sister, Jennifer's college friend, and 2 women from her yoga class. I'd found out at the same time the invitations went out, which was the same time everyone else found out, which was the kind of timing my mother had a talent for. I carried centerpieces, white roses in glass vases, 12 to a table. I set out place cards. I adjusted chair covers. The event coordinator asked me twice if I was with the catering company, and the second time I said yes, because it was easier. At 10 o'clock, my mother came downstairs. She wore a pale blue suit and her pearl earrings and the expression she used when she was in charge of something that mattered. She walked through the ballroom checking each table, moving a fork here, straightening a card there. When she reached me, she stopped. "You're at table 14, she said. "With the Hendersons?" "I saw the card," I said. She adjusted a napkin I'd already folded. "The Hendersons are lovely people. Harold's been a neighbor for 30 years. "Harold's asleep, Mom." She didn't smile. She stepped closer, and her voice dropped to the registers she used when she wanted something to be clear without being loud. "This is Jennifer's day. Sit with the Hendersons. Be polite. And Rachel, don't embarrass us." She walked away. Her heels clicked across the parquet floor, and she stopped at another table to adjust another napkin, and then she went back upstairs to help Jennifer with her veil. I found table 14. It was the last table in the room, pushed into the corner near the kitchen doors. The centerpiece had 3 white roses, the same as every other table, but these were already wilting, the petals soft at the edges, bent in the direction of the heat coming from the kitchen. I straightened one. It held. During the ceremony, I sat in the back pew. I watched my sister walk down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my car. I watched David take her hand, and I watched his face, and I believed he loved her, and I felt glad for that. Genuinely glad, in a way that surprised me. I watched my mother in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd embroidered herself. I watched my father in his wheelchair at the end of the pew, a white rose pinned to his lapel, his right hand resting on the armrest. He didn't look at my mother. He looked straight ahead, at the altar, at nothing. After the ceremony, I went to table 14 and sat down. Harold was already there. He'd fallen asleep during the readings and hadn't woken up since. Next to him was Jennifer's college roommate's husband, a man named Gary who introduced himself, shook my hand, and immediately began reading the drink menu. I decided I would do nothing. I would sit at table 14. I would eat the dinner. I would not stand up and say what I knew. I would not confront my mother or my sister or anyone. I would be polite. I would not embarrass them. I would sit with the dying roses and the sleeping neighbor, and I would be the daughter they wanted me to be. Present, silent, and small. The best man started his toast. Then the maid of honor. The room laughed. The room cried. Glasses clinked. I held the petal that had come off in my hand and turned it over between my fingers. At the head table, James Whitfield was adjusting his notes. James Whitfield stood up. He picked up his glass. The good champagne, the kind David's family served without thinking about the price, and he held it for a moment without drinking. The room was still warm from the maid of honor's toast, still laughing, still loose. He looked out across the ballroom. His gaze didn't start at the head table the way most toasts do. It started at the back. It moved across the room, table by table, face by face, the way a man reads a document, beginning at the margin and working inward. When it reached table 14, it stopped. On me. He set the glass down. The sound of the base touching the tablecloth was small, but the room noticed. Conversations tapered. A few people turned. James loosened his tie. Not all the way, just the knot, the way a man does when he's about to say something he's been thinking about for a while. "Before I talk about my son," he said, "I need to talk about someone in this room that most of you have misunderstood." The room went quiet. 212 faces shifted. Some looked at James. Some looked at each other. My mother's hand moved to my father's wheelchair and gripped the armrest. 3 years ago, James said, Robert Calloway had a stroke. His daughter drove 3 hours that same afternoon and moved into the spare bedroom of her parents' home. She's been there since. He spoke calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He stood with his hands resting on the table, and he spoke the way I imagine he spoke in courtrooms, with facts, in order, without decoration. That daughter paid the medical bills, $800 a month from her own salary. She set up the payment plans. She drove Robert to physical therapy and speech therapy. She sorted the mail. She tended the garden. She slept in a room with a cedar quilt and a window that looked out on roses nobody else was taking care of. Jennifer was looking at David. David was looking at his father. Caroline had set her champagne down and was watching with the careful attention of a woman who had just realized the prenuptial documents were about more than money. I'm a lawyer, James said. I read documents for a living. When my son asked me to review certain financial records before the wedding, I found a story that didn't match the one I'd been told. He paused. $47,000 was withdrawn from Robert's retirement account. It didn't go where it was supposed to go. And the daughter who was paying for everything, who was sleeping in the spare room and folding the towels and sitting by her father's wheelchair every Saturday morning, was not the daughter being credited. He didn't say Jennifer's name. He didn't say my mother's name. He didn't need to. The room understood. I could see it move through the tables like weather, the slow turn of heads, the setting down of glasses, the shift from celebration to something rawer and older. I've been married for 44 years, James said. And the thing I've learned about families is that the person who does the most is usually the person who says the least about it. That person is sitting at table 14 tonight. He picked up his glass. She didn't ask me to say any of this. She didn't ask for a seat at the head table. She didn't ask for anything. But I'm an old man, and I've read the file, and I think the truth deserves a chair. He raised his glass. To Rachel. The room was silent. The kitchen doors swung behind me as a waiter pushed through and then stopped, tray in hand, reading the stillness. Harold, the elderly neighbor who had been asleep for most of the reception, opened his eyes. He blinked once. He looked at me. Then he picked up his water glass and held it up. He didn't say anything. He just held it there. Dorothy was next. She stood up at her table in the middle of the room, her glass raised, her chin steady. She looked at me and nodded once. Then, slowly, the room followed. One glass, then two, then a row, then a wave. Not joyful, not celebratory, but solemn, the way people stand when they've learned something that changes the shape of the evening. My mother did not raise her glass. Her hand stayed on the armrest of my father's wheelchair, and her face had the set, sealed expression of a woman watching a careful construction come apart in public. Jennifer did not raise hers. She looked at the tablecloth. David's hand was on her shoulder, but she didn't reach for it. My father, in his wheelchair, at the end of the front pew, with the white rose pinned to his lapel, lifted his right hand. 1 inch off the armrest, his fingers trembled. He couldn't raise a glass. He couldn't speak. But he lifted his hand and he held it there, and it was enough. I didn't stand up. I didn't speak. I sat at table 14 with the dying roses and the sleeping neighbor who was now awake, and the petal still in my hand, and I looked at my father's hand, shaking, raised, reaching toward something he couldn't say, and I closed my fingers around the petal and held it. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was in my apartment for the first time in 3 years. The landlord had kept my lease. My neighbor, a retired music teacher named Gail, had watered my plants until they died and then bought new ones and watered those. The apartment was smaller than I remembered. The kitchen was narrow and the living room had the one window that faced the parking lot, and the whole place smelled like paint because Gail had convinced the landlord to touch up the walls before I came back. I was unpacking the last box from the spare bedroom. Clothes, mostly. A few books I'd brought from home. The pharmacy receipts I'd been keeping in a folder, organized by month, that I no longer needed to keep. I put the folder in the bottom drawer of my desk and closed it. My mother hadn't called. Jennifer hadn't called. I didn't expect them to, and I tried not to count the days, but I counted them anyway. 21. 3 weeks of silence from the house I'd kept running for 3 years. Dorothy called twice. The first time to tell me she was sorry. Sorry she hadn't seen it sooner. Sorry she hadn't said anything at Thanksgiving 2 years ago when she'd noticed the bills on the counter and my mother had changed the subject. The second time she called to talk about her garden, and her neighbor's dog, and a recipe for lemon pie she'd found in a magazine. She didn't mention my mother. She didn't need to. She was just being there, the way people are there when they've decided you're worth a phone call. My father called once. It was a Tuesday evening. The phone rang and his name came up on the screen. Robert Calloway, the same formal name that had been on the bank statement. And when I answered, I heard breathing. Steady, slow, the breathing of a man in a wheelchair by a window. Then, in the background, my mother's voice. Robert, hang up. He stayed on the line. 11 seconds. I counted them. 11 seconds of breathing and silence, and the distant sound of a television in a room I used to live in. Then the line went dead. I put the phone down and finished unpacking. In the bottom of the box, between a sweater and a book I'd been reading before the wedding, I found the rose petal. The one from the centerpiece at table 14. It was dry now, flat, the color faded from white to the pale brown of old paper. I'd kept it without deciding to. The way you keep a receipt or a ticket stub, tucked into your pocket and forgotten until you empty the box. I opened the book on my nightstand. I put the petal between the pages and closed it. Then I sat on the edge of my bed with the book in my lap and the apartment quiet around me. The parking lot light came through the window and made a stripe across the carpet, the same way the street light had come through my father's window the night before the wedding. I didn't know if I would ever sit at the family table again. I didn't know if there had ever been a seat for me to begin with. But I knew I wouldn't sit at table 14. Not anymore. Not for anyone.